Hello, hello. Wonderful to have you here. What I want to do in today's video is to continue our discussion of these what are called jhanas, these states of deep meditative absorption that we find in particular in the early Buddhist tradition. And we're going to continue by looking today at the third jhana. So if we just to recollect, in the second jhana, we found that the mind was becoming more stilled, more calm, more collected after our initial sort of thoughts and mental activities had died down. We were left with certain feelings, certain kinds of positive, pleasant feelings. But if we continue along that route, this same route that we've been going on of calming the mind, and we try to continue to calm the mind, or rather if the mind continues to calm itself through this process, through this sitting and just getting into the meditative experience, we're going to find that the character of our mental state changes once again. It becomes even more calm. As we turn now to the definition of the third jhana, the definition will give us some insight into what is potentially going to go on here. So the definition says, with the fading away of rapture, they enter and remain in the third absorption, or third jhana, where they meditate with equanimity, mindful and aware, personally experiencing the bliss, or we might translate that same passage, experiencing bliss with the body, of which the noble ones declare, equanimous and mindful, one meditates in bliss. Now, I'll get to this issue about the body in a minute because it is something of a key problem or concern or controversy with some practitioners. But the main point here is that to enter this third jhana, rapture dies away. This, what is the Pali word is piti. It's this kind of effervescent, sort of bubbling, pleasant state that entered our body, entered our mind in the first jhana. With the second jhana, it still remains. However, as we try to calm the mind, this rapture will die away, and once this rapture dies away, then we have entered the third jhana. So just as we saw in the second jhana that these mental operations of vitakka and vichara, focusing the mind, or I should say, putting the mind on its object and keeping it connected, these sort of mental operations, or thinking perhaps, they are, although they're necessary to bring the first jhana into existence, or at least they're part of that first jhana, they disperse the mind too much. They're too active. They're too unsettling of the mind. And so as we calm the mind down into the second jhana, this is what we saw last time, those die away. In the same sense, following the same kind of path, a pleasant state of mind, even though it's pleasant, can be a problem. That is to say, from the point of view of the first and second jhanas, piti or rapture is something pleasant, something to be looked for, something to be enjoyed perhaps. But once we get further down this path towards calm, we begin to see that rapture as problematic. It begins to agitate the mind too much, or at least we begin to realize that by getting rid of it, by calming the mind down, it begins to dissipate. It begins to dissipate, and that dissipation goes hand in hand with the calming of the mind. This is why it's also said that piti, or this rapture, is a thorn to the third jhana. That is to say, that as long as this rapture persists, we're not going to be able to enter that state. So the rapture, as we practice, the rapture dies away, and what we're left with is this pure sukha, is the Pali term, can be translated as happiness or bliss. Generally, bliss is kind of a standard translation. We're left with this kind of pure state of bliss. And we find also a simile with regard to the third jhana, as we did with the first two. And this is what the simile says. It's like a pool with blue water lilies, or pink or white lotuses. Some of them sprout and grow in the water without rising above it, thriving underwater. From the tip to the root, they're drenched, steeped, filled and soaked with cool water. There's no part of them that's not soaked with cool water. In the same way, a mendicant or a monastic or a practitioner drenches, steeps, fills, and spreads their body with bliss free of rapture. There's no part of the body that's not spread with bliss free of rapture. So what we have here is a simile of these water plants, of these lilies or lotuses that are underneath the water, that are being steeped and drenched, their whole bodies steeped and drenched in water. One of the differences between this simile and the first two that we saw has to do with, I think, motion within the simile. We saw in the first simile a lot of active motion, vigorous motion, perhaps implying that the mind had to take an active role. In the second simile, the simile for the second jhana, we saw a much quieter and slower motion of water, of cool water sort of permeating this lake and flowing inside the lake. In this simile, we see arguably no motion at all, or at least a very, very slow motion, perhaps, of the growth of these lilies and lotuses. So it's motion on a scale of days, perhaps, rather than on a scale of minutes and hours. And I think that gives us some insight into what the state is supposed to be like. It's a very, very quiet, nearly motionless state where, again, we see the body interact, that the body is filled with these sensations and these feelings. Now, we've looked at these similes for the first two and now the third jhana. There's also going to be a simile with the fourth jhana that we'll see in the next video. But I wanted to take a minute to speak a little bit about these similes, because there's some controversy over whether these similes are original to the descriptions of the jhanas or not. The descriptions I'm giving, these similes, are from the Pali tradition. There are corresponding similes found in the Chinese tradition, which leads us to believe that, to an extent, these similes go back to a pre-sectarian time, perhaps to the time of the Buddha himself. However, in the Chinese tradition, as far as I understand it, it is somewhat less clear as to whether these similes are actually talking about jhana, or whether they're similes about other kinds of meditative states, such as states of mindfulness, for example. There are many threads about this controversy over at the forum, the Buddhist forum Sutta Central. I will try to link one of these threads down below, in which of course, there are a number of comments. One of them is by a guy named Chris Patton, who is an expert on the Chinese material, and who believes that essentially one of the early Buddhist schools, called the Sarvastivadins, may have had some philosophical disagreement with the idea that, at least in some of these jhanas, the states were felt in the body. They seem to have been more attuned to seeing them as felt in the mind and not in the body, again, for various philosophical reasons that needn't detain us here. And I'm not going to get into all of these concerns. I will say that there is one very famous 4th and 5th century text called the Abhidharmakosha Bhashyam by Vasubandhu, in which he discusses a number of these arguments between various sects, various schools of Buddhism at the time. And it's pretty clear that, all of the schools, except to an extent, at least the ones he discusses, except to an extent, the idea that we feel the jhanas in the body, but not necessarily all the jhanas and not necessarily to the same extent. So what this should bring up for us is something that we have to keep in mind in all of this discussion that I'm going to have about jhanas, which is that many of these issues are somewhat controversial, and different practitioners of jhana will have different opinions about how to, for example, translate these early texts, about how to understand them. As we saw with the passage of the definition of the third jhana earlier, there are different ways even of translating the same words in Pali. One word is translated by some textual scholars as body, because we understand that the jhana is felt in the body. What I read before, experiencing bliss with the body. Whereas other scholars, Bhante Sujato, Bhikkhu Sujato, translates it without the use of the word body. He simply translates it as personally experiencing this bliss. So in other words, the word that we translated as body, he simply translated as understanding something or feeling something personally. And of course, if we aren't feeling these in the body, then we have to set aside the similes that I've been talking about, at least for some of these jhanas, and may feel that these similes aren't really appropriate because they do state quite clearly that all the jhanas are felt in the body. In any event, these are not controversies that I'm going to be able to solve here because they depend really on interpretations of the texts. Many of these interpretations are also themselves going to depend upon our own experience, perhaps, in jhanic meditation. But in any event, continuing on with the definition at hand, which we've sort of left behind here, another aspect of this third jhana is that we abide in it as mindful and equanimous. These are two of the features of the mind that we have when we're in this third jhana. We're in a kind of an open, balanced awareness of what's going on. It's equanimous and mindful. This is one of the ways in which it's understood that mindfulness and the jhanas come together. So some people may think that, for example, well, mindfulness is the seventh of the steps along the Eightfold Path, and jhana comes as the eighth, that is to say, as samadhi, as concentration, right mindfulness, right concentration, the seventh and the eighth stage in the Eightfold Path. However, these do come together because in jhana there is mindfulness. Again, the third jhana includes mindfulness as part of its definition. Now, we should not think that that means that there is thinking going on in the third jhana. We've already gotten rid of thinking back in the second jhana, if, depending on how we interpret these terms vitakka and vichara, most scholars in any event believe that thinking is long gone by the time of the third jhana. The mind is simply open and aware, but there are no active thoughts going on. So from here, what we're going to do in the next video is turn to the fourth jhana, and I will leave a link to it up here on the screen when it's ready. Thanks so much to all of you. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page and seeing if you want to help and support the channel and all the work we're doing here. Thanks again, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.